Today is Thursday, Yom Chamishi. As is our custom on Thursday, we do Igros Kiddush. We're on page Taf Peiches. Page Taf Peiches. The letter is Aleph Reish Dalet. Okay, we're holding by a new letter. Okay, here we go. Today, let's read. Today was Thursday. Today is Chav Gimel Menachem. Chav Gimel Menachem. Now, Baruch Hashem. I'm reading from the beginning of the letter. Tez Ayin El Tov Shin Yud Aleph, Brooklyn, New York. B'mayin al Mechtavi. Somebody wrote the Rebbe a letter asking the Rebbe a question on something that he said in the Sikha. So this Sikha is very, very famous. It really is very, very famous. Because at that time in the Rebbe's Nesius, the Rebbe was not really editing his Sichas. The Rebbe was not really editing his Sichas. The Sichas were all built in Muggah. But for Shabbos Mevarchem El, the Rebbe said a Sicha on Ari Miklat. That you know that is this Shabbos is Shabbos Mevarchem El, right? So I might as well talk about it. That it says in Sforim, I guess in Kisvei Arizal, that Elul has 5 Rosh Tevis, and the 5 Rosh Tevis of Elul correspond to Torah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Tshuva, and Geula. The Rosh Tevis connected to Torah is in Pashas Mishpatim. Ina leyodi v'samti lecha. I'll come back to it after. The Rosh Tevis for Tefillah is Ani l'doidi v'doidi li. The Rosh Tevis for Tzedakah is in the Megillah Sester. Ish l'rei'ehu umatones lo evyoinim is Rosh Tevis Elul. The idea of giving Mishleach Mones Ish l'rei'ehu umatones lo evyoinim is Tzedakah, is Rosh Tevis Elul. The Rosh Tevis for Tshuva is Umol Hashem Melikecha. It's in Parshas Nitzavim. Es levavcha ve'es levav is Rosh Tevis Elul. And the Rosh Tevis for Mashiach is Vayemru Leimer Ashir al Hashem. Ashir al Hashem Vayemru Leimer. In Oz Yoshir, Ashir al Hashem Vayemru Leimer is Rosh Tevis Elul. So the Rebbe has in his letters, the Rebbe, right from the beginning of the Nesius, the Rebbe made from this an Inyan, that Elul has 5 Rosh Tevis. So what the Rebbe said is Elul is Chedesh HaTshuva. So there is the Tshuva of Elul through Torah. Tshuva through Torah. There's Tshuva of Elul through Tefillah. There's the Tshuva of Elul through Tzedakah. There's the Tshuva of Elul through Tshuva itself. And then there's the Tshuva of Elul through Geula. In other words, in Elul you have to do Tshuva. And you have 5 different ways or levels on which the Tshuva of Elul can be accomplished. You can do Tshuva through Torah. You can do Tshuva through Tefillah. You can do Tshuva through Tzedakah. You can do Tshuva through Tshuva itself. Whatever that means. And you can do Tshuva through the Nyan HaGeula. Pidyon. Geula. How you do these things is not at the moment. But the Rebbe spoke then in Elul Tafshin, in Menachem of Shabbos Mevarchem Elul Tafshin Yud Aleph this year. Now it's 70 years ago, 69 years ago. The Rebbe spoke that this is the Inyan of Torah. Where do you have Tshuva through Torah? So the Pasuk says in Pashas Mishpatim, he's talking about a Maki Nefesh Bishgog. If a person, Achmana Litzlan, murders or kills by mistake, shegi, without intent, so he has to go to the cities of refuge, right? You have to run to the cities of refuge, or in Miklat. So the Pasuk says in Pashas Mishpatim, if a make ish v'meis yumas, if a person kills another person with intent, so meis yumas, he will die, right? V'asher leitzada, if he was not laying in ambush, he wasn't waiting to kill a person. The Eibishter made him kill another person, by mistake. Hashem brings it to his hand. So the Pasuk says, I'm going to give you a place to run away. This is Ari Mikla. And of course, you know the Sefer HaChinuch that the Rebbe brings always. The Sefer HaChinuch says that we know that the Eibush is Einshem Amida Keneged Mida. All the Eibush's punishments are measure for measure. So the Rebbe said, Golus is the same thing as Misa. Taking away a person's freedom, locking a person up, not allowing a person freedom of movement, freedom of mobility, is like killing him. So Achman, if someone murders on purpose, and then he has Misa. If he's murdering b'shaygeg, so then he goes away to Golus. You're not actually killing him, but spiritually it's the same in Amisa. So the Lashon HaPasuk is Ina liyadei v'samti loch. Ina liyadei. If it happens to your hand, you didn't prepare. You didn't, in Yiddish, was nit gelokert. You didn't lay an ambush to try and hurt another person. But lay tzada. Elikim ina liyadei. Elikim shem elikim brought to your hand the inyan of Rebbe Chachayim to another human being. So then the pasuk says v'samti loch hamokam shayanus shama. The Eibush is your place to run away. So the four words Ina liyadei v'samti loch is Elul. In other words, there's a connection between Arei Miklat and Elul. So now we have to talk. What's Bepashtus Arei Miklat? Bepashtus Arei Miklat is an escape. It's an escape. It's running away. You don't want what's called the Geil Adam, the relative of the deceased, to take revenge, vigilante killing, vigilante justice. So the Eibush gives you a place where you can run and hide and he's not allowed to touch you. That's the Pashtus. So the Arei Miklat are cities of Shmira and Hagona. They protect the Reitzeach. Yeah? But the word Miklat is a funny word. Why? Because you should really call it not Arei Miklat, but Arei Golus. You should call it Arei Golus. A person murders accidentally, so he's mechuyev to go into Golus, and the Chinuch says that this Golus is tantamount, is equivalent to, with Shoveh, to the Inyan of Misa. It's like Midah Keneged Midah. So Golus is instead of Misa. But the Pasuk calls it Miklat. Miklat doesn't mean a Golus. Miklat means a refuge. But a Miklat doesn't even mean a refuge. A Miklat means an absorption center. A place that takes you in, that holds you, that protects you. So of course, the Chazal, the Gemara already talks about this. That we don't call it a Nir Golus, we call it a Nir Miklat. Because the cities of refuge were not only an einish, it was not only a punishment, they were also a tikkun. And because the cities of refuge, if the cities of refuge were only a punishment, you would call them Arei Golus. Because they're also a tikkun, call them Arei Miklat. What's the Taich Miklat? It takes you in. When a person is Maki Nefesh Bishgoga, the city of refuge doesn't only protect him, the city of refuge takes him in. And it's a form of tikkun, form of correction. So the Gemara says, right? This is the Gemara says, and I'm putting words in the Gemara's mouth because it serves my purposes. I'm putting words in the Gemara's mouth. That whereas, since we don't call them Arei Golus, we call them Arei Miklat, with the understanding that the Arei Miklat are not just protecting you they're not just a punishment for being a Maki Nefesh. They're not even just a Shmira against the Geil Adam, but they're an Inyan of Tikkun, an Inyan of correction. V'harayeh, we call them Ir Miklat, a city that absorbs, that holds, that protects, holds a person. So the Gemara says, Divrei Teira Kiltin, that just like Arei Miklat hold a person, they bring a person in, Teira is an Ir Miklat. So you have to think what's going on here. You know, you can call an Arei Miklat a place where you're being punished, a Golus. You can call an Arei Miklat a place where you're being Megan, being protected from being killed by Meinakesh Bishgoga. But we're calling Arei Miklat a place which is a klite. It raises the Reitzeach up. It heals the Reitzeach by absorbing him, taking into a special city. The Arei Miklat were Arei HaLeviim, you know that. All the cities of refuge belong to the Leviim. And the Leviim, the Torah says, Ani chalcha v'nachaloscha. They're the Eibishter's portion, the Eibishter is their portion. The cities of the Leviim were holy. So a Makei Nefesh went to an Ir Miklat, and it didn't only punish him, it didn't only protect him, it healed him. So the Gemara says, Divrei Torah killed him. Since we understand the Ir Miklat not just as a Golus, since we understand the Ir Miklat not just as a Hatzalah, but we understand the Ir Miklat as a Klita, that's something that takes in, Torah is an Ir Miklat. Just like in space there were Arei Miklat, in Yiddishkeit there's an Ir Miklat, and the Divrei Torah killed him. So the Kisvei Arizal writes, this is the Pshat, Ina liyodei v'samti loch. Ina liyadei v'samti loch Rosh Tevis Elul. This is the miklat of Torah. So the first, that when a person learns Torah, it takes him in, and it protects him. So in the very first Elul of the Rebbe's Nesias, Tafshin Yud Aleph, not Tafshin Yud Aleph, was after the Rebbe said the Mayim Basi Lagani. So Shabbos Mavorachim Elul, the Rebbe spoke a Sikha, and he spoke about Elul, and he spoke about the Rosh Tevis in Elul, and he spoke specifically about the idea did Torah killed him. That when it comes to Elul, we have to do tshuva. And there are different methods, different mechanisms, different levels of tshuva, different techniques for tshuva. And the Rebbe said one of the techniques for tshuva is the tshuva of Torah. That by a Yid learning Torah, the Torah takes him in. And the Torah raises him up. The Torah not only punishes him, the Torah not only protects him, but the Torah heals him, verstehst? And the Rebbe spoke this Sikha, and he edited the Sikha, was Magia the Sikha, which was very uncharacteristic. In those days, the Rebbe didn't have time to edit Sikhas Kvayachol, and asked that it should be mitzparsim. Every letter that Rebbe sent from when he spoke that Sikha, in the end of Menachem Av, Shabbos and Vorchem, he sent a copy of this Sikha. And he asked people to be mefarsim it in the whole world. And people went around, this is a short Sikha, it wasn't very, very long. The Teichen of the Sikha is the tshuva through Torah, the tshuva through Torah. So here we have a letter where someone is asking the Rebbe a question on this Sikha. You understand? The Sikha was very widely distributed, and someone had a kasha. Now before I read the Sikha, I just want to say one more idea. I want to say one more thought. I don't know if this is true. Whenever you say something that doesn't have a source, you say Lanias daiti. I think, I don't know. I don't know if this is true. But why would the Rebbe choose this? The first Elul of his Nesiyas. The Rebbe speaks a Sikha about how Elul is a time of tshuva and focuses specifically on the tshuva of Torah. Edits the Sikha, Shalei Kifidarke, mefarsim the Sikha, Shalei Kifidarke at that time. And it's all about Limud Torah. So I cannot tell you for sure why. But I'm going to tell you a svara. And the svara is that when the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Rebbe made very significant changes in the Ashkofa of Chassidus. He made significant changes in how we think about ourselves as Chassidim. Now, Chas v'Shalom, the Rebbe changed. The Rebbe didn't change anything. The Rebbe represents Ruach Yisrael Sabeh. But as the expression is, the Rebbe made a lot of changes so that nothing should change. And said, if Yiddishkeit is going to remain the same, you have to make adaptations. Yiddishkeit has to be in America. And of course, one of the inyanim about Yiddishkeit has to be in America is that you have to focus on Asay Tev, not on Sur Meirah. In Russia, you could have criticized people and it would be helpful. In America, you criticize the person, he's finished. He's not listening to you. You have to find an Asay Tev Tshuva. Which is why from the beginning of the Rebbe's Nesiyas, the Rebbe started off right away with the idea of Tshuva Mitech Simcha. Right away. Tshuva Mitech Simcha. And also that you start with Tshuva Ilah. Right? In Tanya it says you have to have Tshuva Tatah first and Tshuva Ilah second. Tanya gets the Tshuva. If Tshuva Tatah first and Tshuva Ilah second. And the Alter Rebbe talks you through, he says, Gar Greisa Chasidim, the greatest of people, they did Tshuva Tatah by Krishma Shalamita. The greatest of the great did Tshuva Tatah and Tshuva Ilah at the very, very same time. Mamish at the same moment, like it says in the Zayat, that the left eye was crying, and the right eye was laughing, the left eye was crying because they were doing the Tshuva Tatah and the Tshuva Ilah at the same moment. People who were not on such a high madrega divided it into two times. By night, Krishma Shalamitas Tshuva Tatah, and then Shacharis, in Eindim L'Spal Ela Mitech Keved Reish, and Eindim L'Spal Ela Mitech Simcha, this is already Tshuva Ilah. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, if you can't do it every day, you do it once a week. That Thursday night, this is Tshuva Tatah, and Shabbos, this is Tshuva Ilah. People who cannot do it once a week, do it once a month. That Erev Reish Chodesh, this is Tshuva. Yom Kippur Kodesh is Tshuva. So my Pashas, Erev Reish Chodesh is a Tshuva Tatah. So L'cheira, I don't know this for sure, but I'm going to assume that Reish Chodesh is a Tshuva Ilah. People who can't even do that, you have one day a year, Keit Slicha Mechila, Yom Kippur. But the tradition is, first you do the lower Tshuva, and then you do the higher Tshuva. And the Rebbe encouraged us to skip the lower tshuva, to go straight to the higher tshuva. Or to say it more precisely, first do the higher tshuva, then you'll do the lower tshuva. Not first the lower tshuva. First you do the higher tshuva, then you do the lower tshuva. Even though the Seder is first the lower tshuva, then the higher tshuva. What's the difference between the lower tshuva and the higher tshuva? The lower tshuva is about sin. The higher tshuva is about God. The lower tshuva is, how do I remove the blockages between me and God? The higher tshuva is, how do I become connected to the Eibshter? So the lower tshuva is connected to crying, and to cheshbon hanefesh, and to identifying faults, and to making decisions. Shali Yashaved Lekisla, won't do it anymore. The higher tshuva is pasha to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe brings this, the Alter Rebbe says, what is the higher tshuva? The higher tshuva is Teira and Tefillah. Torah and Tefillah. The lower tshuva is tshuva on Averis. The higher tshuva is connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Teira and Tefillah. But Mele, the first elul of the Rebbe's Nesias, where the Rebbe is talking about tshuva, he says, which tshuva should you choose? You should choose the tshuva of Torah. So again, I don't know this for sure. Of Torah. My presumption is that Rebbe said in the first elul of his Nesias that people should choose the tshuva of Torah because the Rebbe wanted to give us right from the beginning the Indian that tshuva has to be done in our time, in America, from a positive angle. Tshuva law, either only tshuva law or tshuva law before tshuva tata and so on. And I just want to finish this lengthy introduction by telling you that Chayel this year, this letter is Tezainel, yeah? 12 days after this, Chayel of this year, the Rebbe made a fabrengen. And he washed. The Rebbe washed Chayel. The first couple of Chayelos, Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, the Rebbe made a fabreng, and the Suda, and he washed. And then the Rebbe stopped. I don't know why, the Rebbe stopped. But the first few years of the Rebbe's Nesias, the Rebbe made a fabreng in Chayel. I even heard from Label. Rabbi Groner, once mentioned the fabrengen, he said, I think the Rebbe washed. And of course the Rebbe washed, that means the Rebbe benched. The Rebbe benched gave everybody Keshel Brach. And the Teuchen of those was middle of the week. A weekday, Chayel, Yud Aleph and Yud Beis. Then the Rebbe stopped. I don't know why. But the first few Chayelos, after the Friedrich Rebbe was Magala Chayel Eresh and Tavshin Gimel. Nobody knew about Chayel till 1943. It was a brand new Yom Tov. So the first couple of Chayels of the Rebbe's Nesias, the Rebbe Poshet made a Suda. Then he stopped. I don't know why. And in those early Fabrengen of Chayel, the theme of the Fabrengen was Tshuva. The whole Fabrengen was Tshuva. If I'm not mistaken, it was 2 years in a row, Yud Aleph and Yud Beis, if I'm not mistaken. And the Teuchen of the Siches was Tshuva Mitech Simcha. Tshuva Mitech Simcha. Rabbi Yisrael Abkovsky, Zol Gezun Zayin, I work with him in Yeshiva. He could literally be my father, but we're associates. It's a joke that we and him are considered associates. But he told me that he was a boy when Reb Nissen Nemenov came back from the Rebbe after his first trip. His first trip to the Rebbe was Tofshin Tezvav, 1954 to 55, Tofshin Tishrei, Tofshin Tezvav. When he came back to Yeshiva, what was the message that he left, that he came from the Rebbe with? He says he doesn't understand how, but the Rebbe wants everything has to be done b'simcha. When he came back from that first trip, Rabbi Saul Bukowski has a very good memory. He told it to me personally, that when Reb Nissen came back from his first trip by the Rebbe, he said, what's the message from the Rebbe? Out mitech simcha, everything mitech simcha. And Reb Nissen was an old Chabad chassid, he couldn't understand. We know that in Chabad there's room for other midas besides for simcha, including meridus, and if necessary even atzvos. The Rebbe says, alles mitech simcha. So my suspicion is that when the Rebbe gave out this sikha, and he spoke about tshuva, and he said that the tshuva that we should focus on is the tshuva of Torah, divrei Torah koiltin. My suspicion is, I don't know this for sure, but my suspicion is that the reason the Rebbe did this is because the Rebbe was trying to give a positive inyan of tshuva from the get-go, from the beginning of his Nesias. Anyway, now that I talked for 25 minutes about everything but this Igros Kedesh, let's read. The Rebbe, I'm going to answer your question. Shaboy Heyer, this person asked the Rebbe a question. That you quoted the piece of the Sikha, Shal Shabbos Mevorchem El, of Shabbos Mevorchem El, Asher Orei Miklat Hayu B'chol Mokem Shahayu Yehudim. Wherever Jewish people lived together collectively, they had cities of refuge. Page Tov Peiches, Tov Peiches, first paragraph of the new letter. Hein Bamidbar, both in the desert. V'hein be'ever hayardin in Chutz La'aretz, as well as on the other side of the Yarden in Chutz La'aretz. So the Rebbe says, this guy wrote to the Rebbe, Shaila v'sheil hakavana. His question is, Im ever hayardin v'chutz la'aretz hem shnei inyanim, or ishe ever hayardin hu chutz la'aretz. This is such a gewaldige kasha, and the ramifications of Nigla are considerable. He was asking the Rebbe, is the Rebbe saying two things or one thing? We know that Reuven and Gad and Zichasi Shevet Menashe were given the piece of Yerusha on the eastern side of the Yad. It's called Ever Hayad. The Rebbe calls it Ever Hayad in Chutz La'aretz. Halachically, Ever Hayad was Eretz Yisrael. It's part of Eretz Yisrael. So his shaila was, is the Rebbe saying two separate things? Ever Hayad is one thing and Chutz La'aretz is something else? Or is it the same? And Meman of Shech Yavakash. So the Rebbe answers, Baina. If you look at the way I edited the Sikha, you'll see. It says like this, and it's written in Yiddish. Sayin Midbo, both in the desert. Sayin Eretz Yisrael, as well as in Eretz Yisrael. Sayin Ever Hayarden in Chutz La'aretz, as well as on the other side of the Yarden, which is Chutz La'aretz. So the Rebbe is saying, Mipnei Siba, that the area of Ever Hayarden, which belonged to Reuven and Gad, the Chatz Shevet Menashe, at least relative to Eretz Yisrael, is called Chutz La'aretz, outside of Eretz Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, if I had meant that Chutz La'aretz is the fourth category, I would have written a fourth time the word sai. So the Rebbe says the answer to your question is that Ever Hayarden, the area that we call, it's not called Gol, it's called Ever Hayarden. There's another word for it. They call Gilad, Menashe, Ephraim, Menashe, Reuven, and Gad is Chutz La'aretz. V'kavanasi here, what I mean to say is, she'ever hayadin legabe Eretz Yisrael Chutz La'aretz. True, halachically maybe, Ever Hayad is a din of Eretz Yisrael, but compared to the Yidden, the 9.5 Shvatim, who lived in the western side of the Jordan, it's like Ever Hayad. V'ayim b'sefri Pashas Masei, u'baram milchas etzech reish periches, u'bekesef mishne sham, shelatira tzechat b'fadash lashon sefri shekotza sham Chutz La'aretz, she'ever hayadin legabe Eretz Yisrael Chutz La'aretz kari loy. The Rebbe says, I'm showing you places where it says in Sfarim that even though halachically Ever Hayad didn't Eretz Yisrael, Lagabe Truma, Lagabe Maisim, Lagabe Bikurim, and Lagabe other things, but comparative, relative to the western side of the Yad, it's considered Chutz La'aretz. So, the truth of the matter is, if we were Talmidei Chachamim, if we were Bnei Torah, we have to sit and look up this Sifri, and look up this Rambam, and look up this Kesef Mishnah, and understand why. But we're not, so we're going to keep reading, okay? The question that this man asked on the Sifri, why did the Sifri have to bring a rai from the Pasuk that Ever Hayarden also had a miklat when it says befedish in the Pasuk? That these cities are destroyed, we build others. If we can't build them where they were, you build it someplace else. And this is the Alfina Mitevis Tihiyeno, okay, this is Nigla. This is Mamish Nigla. The point is, it says in Chumash, Oz Yavdil Moishe Shorish Orim, Me'ever Hayarden Mizrach HaShemesh, in Parshas Vaschana. Lonus Shama Koler Tzeh, it says, Be'etz Betzer Ba'midbar, Rama is Ba'gilad. It says the names of the city. So the guy asked the Rebbe Akasha, why does the Sifri have to bring a rai from a Pasuk? That you have to have cities of refuge, maybe Layadin, when it says explicitly in the Pasuk, the names of the city. So the Rebbe says, what happens if those cities are destroyed? Is it the pshat that those cities are already miklat, and if those cities are destroyed, there is no already miklat of Yadin, because it's Chutz La'aretz, relative to Yisrael, says the Rebbe, no. Sifri says, if those cities are destroyed, you build others. And if you can't build them there, you build them someplace else, etc., etc., etc. Okay, let's read the next letter. Let's start, yeah? Rabbi Blooming is coming, yeah? Okay, let's start the next letter. Okay, so we spent a lot of time, a lot of time talking about tshuva and a few minutes reading the letter. Let's read the next letter. Yud Tes Elo Tov Al Brooklyn, New York, Harav Agon, Harav Chosid, Vosik, V'chosid, Ish Yerei Elikim, Nichbud, V'nayle, Esik, B'tzargetiba, V'chulu, Moreinu, Harav, Osher, Shayich. This letter was written by the Rebbe to a Yid whose name was Harav Osher. It says in the bottom, Abram's son. Osher, Abram's son, was a Tamim. He learned in Lubavitch. And he was a big Yerei Shammai. And he was a big Chassid. And he lived in Australia. He lived in Australia. Now, there were not a lot of Lubavitchers living in Australia. How did he get to Australia? He was a Tomim. He learned in Lubavitch. Why did he get to Australia? So the way I understand it is, I could be wrong, he was married, Bezivik Sheni, to Mrs. Gutnick, Rabbi Chaim Gutnick, and he had a brother whose name I forgot. They had, their father passed away in 1933, before the war. Their father gave to Mordechai Zev HaKoyen Gutnick. He was at Rav in London, I think. He died in the 30s. And he left an almana with two Yosemim. They were little children with an almana, their mother. So they went to learn in yeshiva. And then they ended up in Australia. And the other Bocharim who ended up in Australia were sent to America. They had asked the Frierdiker Rebbe about leaving Australia, and the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote to them, if you ended up in Australia, you're supposed to stay. So these two young Gutnick boys, they were boys, teenagers, yeshiva Bocharim, remained in Australia, and after the war, their mother and their stepfather joined them. They were Mastama living in Melbourne, and the parents living in Sydney. Osher Abrams, Harav Abrams, and he was a big chassid, the big Yerei Shema, he was a big Rav. I saw letters of his where he's writing about the kashrus. He was a frum Yid, and he came to Australia and he saw that there was Yidden, and there was a lot of corruption. The kashrus wasn't kashrus, the mikveh wasn't mikveh, everything was b'diyevid, it wasn't even a tatum, sometimes the pashat not kosher. And this Harav Osher Abrams' son, as a Lubavitcher Yid, was Meisa Nefesh, that to make the kashrus better. He was one of the founders of the Orthodox, of the Frum community in Australia. He was one of the most important personalities. He was in touch with the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then he was in touch with the Rebbe. He lived in Sydney, and he was a very, very important one of the early Lubavitcher Hasidim. You know, he was a shliach so long ago you don't even know he was a shliach. You know, that kind of thing. He was a Rav, and he was involved with kashrus, was involved with mikvahs. He did a lot of very big pu'ulas in Australia. You're talking now in 1948 and 1949. This is 51 already. And the Rebbe is writing a letter to this Harav Abramson about Yiddishkeit in Australia. Now, I don't have time to read the letter with you because Rabbi Blooming is here, but I do have time to tell you a story. Rabbi Blooming had a Gesidische Meise. Mein Mechuten, so sein gesund und stark, is Rabbi Levi Weinberg from Melbourne, from Johannesburg. He was on Shlichus in Australia in 1975, 76, 77, I think. Levi Weinberg. So the yeshiva was in Melbourne. And Yom Tif, the Bachim were not in yeshiva. So some of the shluchim went to Sydney to help out with the shlichus in Sydney. To do miftzoyim, to be involved with the kehillah. This is 45 years ago. When they came to Sydney, hat man sich gesagt, that here's an old Rav, this is 1975, this is 25 years after this letter, Harav Abramson, and Layalei knew he had a stroke. He had a stroke, Erev Yom Kippur, he had a stroke, he was laying in the hospital, and he couldn't speak at all. The Bochrim came for Sukkot. Rabbi Weinberg's father was Rabbi Yosef Weinberg, a Metzuyin, a special man. Rabbi Yosef Weinberg got from the Rebbe case Shel Bracha Rosh Hashanah, from the Rebbe case Rosh Hashanah, and he sent it to his son Levi in Australia. I don't know how. When Rabbi Levi Weinberg, the Bocher, the son, came to Sydney, he had wine, Keshel Bracha, from the Rebbe, from Rosh Hashanah, from that year. So when they came to Sydney, the Anash said, listen, Harav Abramson was sick. And he was ushpaz, he was in the hospital. Go visit him. So they came to visit him. So Rabbi Weinberg brought along this Keshel Bracha. And he gave a little bit of wine to this Harav Abramson, and he said to him, this is Keshel Bracha from the Rebbe, from this Rosh Hashanah. He had the stroke Erev Yom Kippur. Now it's Sukkot. It's Kama V'Kama Yomim La'acharei Zet, a week or more after. He says, I gave him the cup. Rabbi Weinberg told me the mice. And I told him that this is Keshel Bracha from the Rebbe from this year. So he sat up, took the becher, the cup, and Levi said, he looked past me, like as if I wasn't standing there. And he said, L'chaim Rebbe. Those were the first two words he had uttered since the stroke. He hadn't spoken at all. The first words of L'chaim. So Levi said to me, hab ich verstanden, was steht. As the Stock Erichok Mokem. Zwischen der Chassid mit der Rebbe, there's no separation of space. Okay.